urban green spaces. Exactly. So this is one of the examples. This is a community garden. There's also more landscaped types of green spaces available in urban cities. And there's also spaces like parks or riparian corridors that are important for wildlife. And why are they important? So if you're walking in the city, sometimes you walk in New York City or anywhere, it's extremely hot. And if you stand under a tree or if you go kind of in a small park, you cool off. So they provide microclimatic refuges in a way, not just for people, but also for wildlife. So other reasons that they're important for what species? So it can be for humans, but also for certain birds. And certain birds need it more than others. And for example, you can see pigeons they're out in the open in plain concrete. But if you think of migratory birds, birds are very sensitive to overheating. So one of the reasons that a lot of birds don't get as sick is because they have a core body temperature that is like a permanent fever. It's about 100, don't quote me on this because I can forget, it's like 102 degrees. And so they are really, really sensitive to overheating, as are we. And so for what species are some of these urban green spaces important? Also, what different types actually benefit some of the wildlife populations that we find? Since we know there's different types of green spaces in urban cities, which ones are the ones that are most crucial and for what species? One of the groups that urban green spaces are very important for is migratory birds. So this bird here was banded in an urban park in Milwaukee, where there's an urban ecology center, the rose-breasted grosbeak. And so if you think about, a lot of us are probably gonna go either close by or very far for Christmas. You have to travel. So if you think you're going along the highway and some of those rest areas that that they're kind of like a crappy rest areas that only have the bathrooms, you don't usually stop there, unless you really gotta go. But so you're driving along, you're usually gonna stop at a place where there's enough food, where you can actually maybe bring out the food that you're carrying with you and have a picnic. And so similar to that, migratory birds, they migrate for thousands of miles and they face a lot of dangers in a way, a lot of sources of mortality, as we like to say. And imagine them going through where I'm from in Costa Rica. There's a lot of agricultural fields where there's pesticides and there's many different things that they have to face as they migrate up here. Climate, as we know, all the hurricanes and stuff that happens in the tropics. So they migrate thousands of miles at a time, and eventually they do along that route have to find where to stop and refuel. So what types of places in urban cities are good for this? So we're gonna pretend we're birds right now for a little bit. And all the maps I'm gonna show you today, they are from Google Earth, which has become my favorite toy. I found my house in Costa Rica with Google Earth and I sent it to my mom. She thought we could spy on her. I had to tell her it was a picture. And so this is kind of a tool that you can use also to find the location of your green space, and you can even measure the area, and this is free software. Another reason why I love it. So let's pretend we're birds, and you've been migrating from South America all through, you're pretty tired, you're running out of storage, fat storage, and as you come down, there's another feature, you can have 3D buildings, which is pretty interesting. So as you come down the city, where are you gonna stop and refuel? What's the rest area that's gonna look the most appealing? So let's pretend we're flying down and you're trying to scope. You see a little bit of green and you go, oh, okay, there's a couple places. So would you go here? Kind of these bigger green spaces. Are they gonna have the food I need? Are they gonna have the shelter I need? Or if these roofs had rooftop gardens, would you stop there? Because you don't have to go as far down. It would be more accessible. You wouldn't face as many dangers maybe. It would pop out more at you. Or would you know certain places that you stopped at last year that had the food that you needed. And those are the ones that no matter if you had bigger spaces nearby, they might be landscaped with fig trees, or invasive plants that don't have the food you need. So you're going to look for these small pockets that have the food and shelter that you're looking for. Or are you just a picky bird, or you just really need a wide open space where if you're a flock, there's going to be enough room for everyone to stop and refuel. And why is this important? Why do we need to think about this? And Karen already mentioned a little bit about current urbanization trends. And 80% of the human population lives in urban areas. And I was pretty shocked by this figure myself. And it's not so conservation, wildlife conservation in urban habitats really is going to be important, not just for the environmental, for the educational component, but it's really going to help guide global conservation. And we really need to study urban biodiversity because in a way it's going to provide ecological knowledge that we're going to be able to use in urban planning. And so if we don't have the information of what types of spaces, what do we need to have in these green spaces in order for wildlife to be able to use these green spaces and benefit from them, we're not going to be able to help green our cities in a way. So this is LA, which when I think of LA, I don't think of a green city. And so let's say you're a migratory bird still, and what can be considered good stopover habitat when in an area that's so heavily urbanized? So would you stop over here? Because as you can see here, there's kind of more of a percentage of green. There's kind of riparian corridors around there. As you can see, some of these corridors right there, there's more of a percentage of green than, let's say, that area right there. But what if you don't need that much percentage of green? What if all these tiny little green pockets that we see here, what if those are enough for you? So one of the spaces that we know that birds use in cities are riparian corridors. And this is a great example. Again, this is a picture from Milwaukee. And they have one park by the lake. And right here, the city really made an effort to green to make this corridor happen. And because this river used to be dammed, it had several dams on it. So they've not only done restoration on the actual corridor, but on the river as well. And so they took down several dams, they dredged a bunch of toxic sludge that had accumulated since the 40s, I think. And right here is the Urban Ecology Center that I mentioned. And I worked there for a little bit before starting grad school here. And that's kind of where I became interested in urban birds as kind of a side interest, because I would go, and since I speak Spanish, I would be the translator for a lot of the urban groups that would come in. And to me, the most shocking point was when we were taking these kids out in the river, we were doing some invertebrate sampling, and these ducks flew by, and the kids screamed and ducked. I mean, they ran as if it was like torpedoes coming to get them. I was like, wow, it just dawned on me, like, because I grew up scraping my knees in every tree that I could find, and so it was I realized, like, this is really important. And so right here in the center, they have a banding station, and where you can find pretty interesting birds. And this is the Nashville warbler, I think. I know my Costa Rican birds a lot better than my birds up here. So another riparian corridor it's in a more urban setting than the one in Milwaukee, is this one right here, and it's in Minneapolis. But also they have, as you can see, there's different pockets of green throughout the city. So this kind of helps us visualize how we can connect maybe the riparian corridors with other areas around it, where you can also find wood thrushes in the riparian corridor here. So can migratory birds use other types of urban green spaces? So one of the things that we're interested in, just moving also aside from migratory birds is what bird species only benefit from large parks? What bird species you cannot find anywhere else, no matter how much restoration you do? They really actually do need a bigger area. Or are other species more influenced by a network of green spaces? So if you remember those photographs, if you take a potted plant here, if you take a community garden here, or a riparian corridor here, all that adds up to a network of green spaces. So what species can actually use these networks and kind of add them up to total habitat that they can use? So this is something that has been an ongoing debate in the field of conservation biology. And what SLOS means is several large or several small. So this is a big topic that was debated, whether you should have one large park. Is that better than several small parks? So one large piece of habitat, is that better than several pieces of habitat? And really, it's a matter of scale. So if you are a hamster, you're kind of really influenced just by what's in your cage. In a way, you're not really going to care what's outside, what's on the table, what's out the door. But if you have other needs, if you're a human, your scale of needs, your scale of what you consider as your world or your habitat is much larger. So one of them is a matter of scale. The other depends on the ecology of the species that we're talking about, whether they're a migratory bird or whether they're a resident bird like a chickadee that's here all year round. So the perception of habitat and what you need is really going to depend on the scale that you perceive and also in your ecology. So here comes the graphs. So bear with me, I'm trying to explain them. I stared at them for a long time to make sure I knew everything about them. Some of the research that has gone on, not just, people have been looking at urban green spaces all over the world. And one of the things that they look at is these questions. So how many species do we have given a certain area of a park? So this is actually a simple graph. So we have here on the vertical axis species richness, so total number of species. And over here we have the area of the park. So, and you can see Osaka, which is in Japan, they measured different parks of different areas within the city and then found out what the species richness. And some species of some regions of the world are not as diverse, so they're ultimately going to have lower number of species. But you can see there's a trend that the more the area, of course, the more the species. But let's say if you're debating whether to have an 80-hectare or 100-hectare park in the city, the change is not that much. And so if you know this information, if you know this threshold in a way, it helps really guide urban planning. Another thing that people have looked at is species richness, again, the number of species versus a network of green spaces. So this was one of the most interesting graphs I found. So this is number of species here, and here's the percentage of paved ground. So if you have a very low percentage of paved ground, it's basically a park. If you have a very high percentage, this looks like a park to me a little bit, but I think if you have a high percentage of paved ground, it looks more like right downtown Fifth Avenue in New York City and not a tree with a bench. But as you can see, species richness tends to decrease depending on the amount of pavement that you have surrounding there. So if you can decrease the amount of paved ground by community gardens or small, even balcony gardens or rooftops, then you are going to ultimately increase the number of species that you can have. So this was a little trick here. So population size versus density. So the total number of individuals of a species in a population versus how many of them there are within a given area. So the analogy I'm going to give you first is if you think of a bus. So how many people can fit in a bus? We're the population. So if we were all to try to get into a bus, our density increases as our size increases. As more people try to get into the bus, the density of people in that bus increases. So once the bus is full, our population is going to decrease because no one else can get on the bus, right? But let's say we had a couple taxis right next to the bus. So we can get on the taxis and on the bus, and our population size increases, but kind of the density is more sparsed out. So I don't know if that worked for you guys or not. I thought of the best analogy that I could. So this right here is population density, and this is population size. So as we increase the number of individuals, the density in a park increases, but there's only so many individuals can fit. And so when it hits that point, that threshold, density is going to go down, but the population size will still increase if there's a place where they can overflow. So if you can think of it this way, here's the park, here's where the highest density is. And as your population size increases, if there's a wooded street, your population can increase because that's where the extra individuals that don't fit, that's where they will go. The surplus will go. So you can increase your population size if you have somewhere else for individuals to go. So this is the idea of this threshold effect. And I found it a very exciting idea because, so the threshold is the minimum total area required to attract a specific species of interest. So if, let's say, if I was living in LA and I, tore up my, paved driveway and just restored it with native plants, with native species, all these species of plants that provide food and habitat, I might not get anything other than a sparrow if there's really not enough habitat surrounding where I am to attract other bird species. So someone that looked at this was Will Turner, Dr. Will Turner from Conservation International. And he looked at desert scrub species in Tucson, Arizona. So he said, so how much habitat do I really need to have in an area, and at what scale, to attract certain species of birds that are highly dependent on desert scrub? And so he did a bird census, and it was a volunteer-based project, which I found really interesting. And so he said, okay, for Gambel's quail, which is a species it's a desert scrub species, the current level of desert scrub in Tucson is, the percentage of cover is 5.8%. But where it was found within that whole region was where there was at least 15% cover. And so at a local and kind of a broader scale, I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So he said 15% is the minimum amount we need of desert scrub in Tucson for Gambel's quail to occur in an urban area. So how can we reach this percentage? He said through restoring yards, parks, open spaces. And so by increasing the percentage of habitat, that's how we can start attracting some birds, because we will have a sufficient network that goes past the threshold level. So this is the trickier graphs. So this is, for the curve-billed thrasher, this is still the same study. And right here, this is percentage of desert scrub at a local level, so within 1 kilometer. And right here is the percentage of desert scrub at a landscape level, so within, I think it was 20 kilometers. And so you can see that as percentage of local habitat increases, the occupancy also increases. And the occupancy is the probability that if I go somewhere, I will detect that species. I will find that species. It's occupying that space. And also, occupancy increases slightly as the percentage of habitat at a landscape scale. So these results I found really interesting because this tells me that the curve-billed thrasher is influenced at both scales, at habitat found locally and at a broader range. But not all species are going to do that. So this other species, the gilded flicker, as you can see, occupancy here increases at a landscape scale, but it increases a little, it increases also at a local scale, but not as much as the other one. So this tells me that this species needs kind of broader efforts to bring her back. It would mean, if you think of it practically, means getting a lot more community groups throughout a bigger area to restore habitat to bring the species back. And this one, Gambel's quail, which you can see there's an increase in occupancy at a landscape level. But see, here is kind of where the threshold effect would be. After that, it always occurs. But there's really no change. There's not that much of a change as the local habitat increases. So what does this really tell us, to wrap up? Is that it's a joint effort, and that every type of green habitat really helps to add to this threshold effect for different species. So every little bit, whether it's a potted plant, a backyard or a large park, every little bit counts because it becomes part of this habitat network. And so for our Celebrate Urban Birds, what we're trying to do is determine, so what species of birds use different types of green spaces? How much of it and in what form do they need? And to what species does it matter the most, and at what scale? So whether urban green spaces, whether it's a nice, beautiful park, small potted plants, community garden, well, another potted plant. We can actually work together to help support and monitor birds in these green spaces to really provide sound ecological knowledge that's going to help us say what really matters, what do we really need to do in certain parts of the city to help these wildlife populations. And this will ultimately help in the kind of universal goal of just preserving global biodiversity. So it's preserving and celebrating urban birds like the blue-headed vireo and Trail's flycatcher. Thank you.